There's a particular kind of betrayal that hits different when it comes from the people who were supposed to be in your corner. Not from rivals, not from critics on the internet, from the institution that was supposed to be your home. And right now, if the rumors circling the basketball world are anywhere close to accurate, Clark is living through exactly that kind of moment. And the WNBA may have just made the single most devastating mistake in the history of women's professional sports. Because here is what nobody wants to say out loud. This league did not just fumble a PR moment. It did not just make a clumsy roster decision or miss a few flagrant foul calls. According to reports from insiders, journalists, and people close to the situation, the WNBA systematically treated its most valuable asset like a threat, and now that asset is reportedly done playing nice. The murmurs are getting louder, the silence from Clark's camp is getting heavier, and the league is suddenly staring down a future where the one name that changed everything might not be on the marquee anymore. This is not a story about one bad game or one controversial call. This is the story of how an entire institution looked at a generational talent, a cultural phenomenon, a young woman who brought millions of new eyes to a sport that desperately needed them, and decided, repeatedly and at every level, that the old way of doing things mattered more than the revolution standing right in front of them. It is a story about ego, about gatekeeping, about a commissioner who had one job in a critical moment and failed spectacularly. And it is a story that is nowhere close to finished. But to understand where things stand right now, you have to go back to where it all started to crack, because the breaking point did not arrive overnight. It was built brick by brick, decision by decision, starting with what many people are already calling the worst roster call in modern sports history. When the Indiana Fever Selection Committee sat down to finalize the roster for the Paris Olympics, they had a choice in front of them that seemed, to anyone watching from the outside, almost impossible to get wrong. Clark had just completed a rookie season that shattered records that had stood for decades. She was leading the league in assists, she was hitting deep threes from distances that made veteran defenders look like they were standing still. She was selling out arenas that had been half empty for years. She was the reason casual sports fans who had never watched a WNBA game in their lives were suddenly clearing their Sunday schedules. And the selection committee looked at all of that and said, "Not yet." The official reasoning they put forward was built around two words: experience and chemistry. They argued that Clark had not yet paid enough dues at the professional level. They suggested that integrating her fast-paced, high-usage, deep shooting style into a veteran system would require more time than the Olympic timeline allowed. They framed it as a basketball decision, a tactical call made in the best interests of the team's chances at gold. And on the surface, if you squinted hard enough and gave them every possible benefit of the doubt, you could almost see the logic. Except nobody actually believed it. Because here's the thing about the experience argument. It doesn't hold up against the evidence. It never did. The same player they said needed more time to develop had spent her rookie season doing things that established pros with years of experience could not do. The same player they said would disrupt team chemistry had spent months proving she could elevate every single person she shared a court with. The assists numbers alone told a story that made the committee's reasoning look not just questionable, but almost deliberately misleading. What the decision actually communicated, beneath all the tactical language and committee speak, was something far more personal. It was a message delivered not in words, but in actions, and it landed with the kind of clarity that does not require translation. You may be generating the ratings, you may be selling the jerseys, you may be the reason the cameras are rolling and the seats are filled, but you are not one of us, not yet, maybe not ever on our terms. For millions of fans who had followed Clark from her college days, who had watched her grow into one of the most exciting players the sport had ever produced, that message was devastating. For Clark herself, who had grown up dreaming about representing her country, it was something she absorbed quietly and professionally, which, as it turns out, does not mean she absorbed it without consequence. The Olympic exclusion was the first brick, but what came after it was a wall.
The moment the WNBA season tipped off, it became obvious that something was deeply wrong with the way the league was managing what was happening on the court. Not in a vague, hard-to-pin-down way, in a documented, filmed, repeatedly witnessed way that played out on national television in front of audiences that had tuned in specifically to watch the sport's newest star. From the very first weeks of the season, Caitlin Clark was being physically targeted in ways that went well beyond competitive basketball. This was not hard defense. This was not the kind of physical play that veterans use to test rookies and establish respect. What Clark was absorbing on a near-nightly basis crossed into something that veteran players, analysts, and fans across the spectrum, including many who had no particular allegiance to Clark, recognized as something uglier. The incident that became impossible to ignore involved Chennedy Carter. Clark went down hard before the ball was even in play, the result of a blindside hip check that came with no warning and drew immediate outrage from everyone watching. The clip went viral within hours. The comment sections exploded. The conversation stopped being about basketball and started being about something much more uncomfortable, about whether what was happening to Clark was being allowed to happen because of who she was, where she came from, and what she represented to a league that had complicated feelings about all three. But the Carter incident was not an isolated moment. It was the most visible point on a line that ran through the entire season. Face guarding, violent shoves that officials consistently chose not to call, double teams that collapsed on her before she even set her feet, physical punishment that accumulated game after game, while the league's response remained for an uncomfortably long stretch of time, essentially non-existent. The silence from WNBA leadership in those early weeks was deafening in the worst possible way. In a moment that called for clarity, for the people running the league to stand up and say that what was happening was unacceptable, regardless of who the target was, they chose to say almost nothing. Flagrant calls that should have been automatic were hesitated over. Suspensions that the situation seemed to demand were delayed until the public pressure became impossible to absorb. The league managed the story reactively, defensively, and slowly, which, when your biggest star is being physically targeted on camera, is the exact wrong approach at the exact wrong time. There are people who will argue that this kind of physical treatment is just part of the game, that rookies get tested, that veterans establish pecking orders, that what Clark experienced was not fundamentally different from what any young player goes through when they enter a league full of people who have been there longer and want to make sure they know it. And there is a version of that argument that has some truth in it, taken on its own terms. But context matters, and the context here, the scale of the targeting, the consistency of it, the league's reluctance to intervene, the racial and cultural dynamics swirling around the whole situation, made what was happening to Clark something that could not be honestly reduced to routine rookie hazing. This was a statement being made, and the league's silence was its own kind of statement in response. Then the commissioner opened her mouth, and everything got worse. Cathy Engelbert has been running the WNBA through what should have been, by any measure, the most exciting period in the league's history. Record attendance, record television deals, a level of mainstream cultural attention that the sport had been chasing for decades. And sitting at the center of all of it, generating the energy that was making every single one of those achievements possible, was a 22-year-old from Iowa who had done nothing but work, perform, and handle an almost impossible amount of pressure with remarkable composure. So when Engelbert sat down for a CNBC interview and was given a direct opportunity to address the toxicity surrounding Clark, the physical targeting, the racial hostility from certain corners of social media, the death threats, the ugliness that had attached itself to the Clark phenomenon like a shadow, what she said was stunning. She compared it to Magic Johnson and Larry Bird. Let that land for a second. When asked about documented racist abuse, about threats directed at a young athlete, about a pattern of on-court physical targeting that the league had been painfully slow to address. The commissioner of the WNBA reached into the vault of basketball history and pulled out the most famous rivalry of the 1980s and offered it up as a frame for what was happening. She talked about marketing value. She talked about how important this kind of rivalry was to the business of the league. She sat there and effectively told the world that what she saw when she looked at the hate directed at Caitlin Clark was an opportunity.
She did not call out racism. She did not denounce the threats. She did not draw a clear, unambiguous line and say that regardless of how anyone felt about Clark's place in the league, the kind of hatred being directed at her was unacceptable and the WNBA would not tolerate it. She did none of those things. Instead, she smiled and talked about the bottom line. The backlash was instant, and it came from everywhere. Sports journalists who cover the league critically, fans who had been frustrated by the situation for months, and perhaps most tellingly, the WNBA Players Association itself, the organization that represents the players and generally supports league expansion and leadership, felt compelled to release a statement making clear that Engelbert's framing did not reflect their views. When your own players' union has to publicly distance itself from something you said, you have not just made a mistake, you have created a crisis. Players like Napheesa Collier and Breanna Stewart, who have been among the most thoughtful and respected voices in the league, stepped forward to say what the commissioner would not, that racism in sports is not a marketing opportunity, that it is a problem that demands a real response, and that framing it otherwise does a disservice to everyone involved. The fact that athletes had to provide the moral clarity that league leadership refused to offer was not lost on anyone paying attention. For Clark, who had watched all of this unfold while continuing to show up, compete, and refuse to publicly air her grievances, Engelbert's interview was reported to be a significant moment, not just because of what the commissioner said, but because of what it revealed about how the league viewed her situation. She was not a young woman being targeted and deserving of protection. She was a storyline. She was content. She was, in the commissioner's framing, essentially a vehicle for generating the kind of drama that drives clicks and keeps people tuned in. Imagine being the person whose performance is responsible for charter flights, record contracts, and unprecedented revenue growth, and then watching the person who runs your league go on national television and suggest that the harassment directed at you is good for business. That is not a moment you forget. And according to people close to the situation, Caitlin Clark did not forget it. In the world of professional sports, when rumors reach a certain level of intensity and specificity, the standard response from a player's camp is swift and clear. A statement gets released. An agent picks up the phone. Someone with access to the player makes sure the narrative gets corrected before it takes on its own life. It is not a complicated playbook, and teams of people get paid significant amounts of money to execute it without delay. Which is what makes the silence surrounding the Clark leave rumors so loud. Reports have been circulating with increasing frequency and from sources that have proven credible on other stories that Clark has quietly communicated to people around her that she has no interest in continuing to make herself available for the national program under the current conditions. That she has told insiders she is done with the Indiana Fever situation as it currently exists. That the combination of the Olympic exclusion, the on-court targeting, and Engelbert's interview has pushed her to a place where the calculus of what the WNBA offers her versus what it costs her has shifted in a fundamental way. And from Clark's camp, nothing. No denial, no reassurance, no carefully worded statement designed to keep everyone calm and the narrative under control. Just silence. In public relations, silence is never neutral. It is always a message, especially when it looks like the absence of one. The silence around these rumors does not mean that Clark is definitively walking away from anything, but it absolutely means that significant conversations are happening behind closed doors. It means that her team is not in a hurry to protect the league's comfort. And it means that Clark herself is in a position of leverage that she is, at minimum, in no rush to give up. Because here is the reality of her situation. Stripped of all the noise and the politics and the complicated history, Caitlin Clark does not need the WNBA in the way that the WNBA needs Caitlin Clark.
That asymmetry is not an opinion, it is a mathematical fact that you can trace directly through the league's attendance figures, its television ratings, its sponsorship deals, and the size of the media rights contract it was able to sign after she arrived.
She knows she is the source of the ratings. She knows that when Indiana Fever plays, the cameras are there because of number 22. She knows that the jersey sales and the sold-out arenas and the casual fans who couldn't name another player on her team are all part of the same phenomenon. And that phenomenon has her face on it. She is not a product of the WNBA system. She is, at this point in history, larger than it. And the people who have been treating her like she should be grateful just to have a seat at the table may have fundamentally misread how long someone with that kind of leverage is willing to stay in a situation that disrespects them. The Whisper Network is not whispering anymore. It is talking at a normal volume, and the league had better be listening. Before Caitlin Clark was drafted, the WNBA was a league with a dedicated and passionate fan base operating on the financial margins of professional sports. Arenas were half-filled on a good night. The league's television deals were modest. Players were flying commercial, earning salaries that, compared to their male counterparts, were almost impossible to justify to anyone who had watched them play. The sport was good. In many ways, it was great. But it was not breaking through to the mainstream in the way that everyone involved knew it needed to. Then Clark came off the board, and the floor dropped out from under every previous benchmark the league had set. League-wide attendance jumped by more than 40% in the season following her draft selection. Not at one team, not in one market. Across the entire league, in cities where Clark was not playing, the rising tide effect was real and it was measurable. People who had never been to a WNBA game before were showing up because the league suddenly felt like something they needed to be part of. The energy was different. The stakes felt higher. The sport had acquired a gravitational pull that it had never quite had before. The television numbers told an even more dramatic story. Viewership figures that the league had been working toward for years materialized almost overnight. Networks that had treated women's basketball as a scheduling obligation started treating it as a priority. The media rights deal the WNBA was able to negotiate in the wake of Clark's arrival came in at over $2 billion, a number that represented a transformation, not an improvement. That kind of money does not come from incremental growth. It comes from a fundamental shift in how the market perceives a product's value. And the players felt all of it. Not just the Indiana Fever roster. Every player in the league benefited from the financial expansion that Clark's arrival triggered. The charter flights that had been a long-standing demand from players who were exhausted from commercial travel became a reality. Salary structures improved. Sponsorship opportunities multiplied. The entire ecosystem of women's professional basketball moved to a higher level because one player changed the conversation around the sport at a scale that nothing had managed to do before. Here is the part that should be making everyone in the league deeply uncomfortable. The same players who benefited most directly from all of that growth were, by multiple accounts, among the most resistant to Clark's presence. The veterans who had spent years fighting for better conditions, better pay, better travel, better treatment from the league, found themselves in a position where the thing that finally delivered those conditions was something they had complicated feelings about. And some of them, rather than acknowledging the awkward reality of that situation, chose instead to make Clark's life harder. The irony is not subtle. The checks got bigger because of Clark. The planes got nicer because of Clark. The league became financially viable in a new way because of Clark. And the response from certain corners of that league was to exclude her from the Olympics, allow her to be physically targeted on the court, and create a professional environment so hostile that she is now reportedly reconsidering her relationship with the entire national program. You cannot build a financial revolution on someone's back and then treat them like an outsider. It does not work that way, and the bill for that contradiction is coming due. Professional sports leagues develop cultures. They develop hierarchies, unwritten rules, ways of doing things that get passed down from one generation of players to the next.
In many cases, those cultures are the source of the sport's strength, the accumulated wisdom of generations of competitors who fought hard to build something worth protecting. But those same cultures can calcify. They can become defensive. They can transform from something worth preserving into something that simply resists change, because change is threatening to people who have built their identities around the way things used to be. The WNBA has been controlled in many ways by a tight circle of veterans who have played together, competed together, and built relationships over more than a decade. Those relationships are real and they matter. The history those players share is genuine and it deserves respect. But when that circle becomes a closed club, when the culture it generates starts operating as a barrier rather than a foundation, it stops serving the sport and starts serving itself.
Reports from people close to the Indiana Fever situation suggest that several seasoned players made their feelings about the Clark situation known before the Olympic roster was even finalized. The concern, as it was framed in those conversations, was about chemistry, about the disruption that would come from integrating such a high-profile, high-usage player into a system that had been built around a different style of play. About what the Clark circus, the cameras, the attention, the millions of new fans who came specifically to see her, would do to a team trying to focus on winning gold. Some of that concern was probably genuine. High-profile additions to established teams always create adjustment challenges, and the Olympic setting added pressure that made everyone more protective of what they had built. But the framing of those concerns, the specific language that reportedly circulated, the idea that Clark's presence was a circus rather than an opportunity, revealed something more complicated than tactical caution. It revealed resentment. It revealed a discomfort with the spotlight shifting in a direction that some veterans had not anticipated and were not comfortable with. Because the truth that sits underneath all the tactical language is this: Caitlin Clark threatened the established order not because she was difficult or disruptive or unprofessional. She threatened it because she was better than the narrative some people had built their careers on. She came in and led the league in assists as a rookie. She set records. She made the sport more exciting and more accessible to more people than it had been in a generation. And for players who had spent years being told they were the future of women's basketball, watching a newcomer do all of that in her first season was not a comfortable experience. Sheryl Swoopes is the most visible manifestation of this dynamic, and she deserves her own moment of examination, because what she has been doing is remarkable in its audacity. Swoopes is a genuine legend of women's basketball. Her accomplishments are real, her place in the sport's history is secured, and her perspective on the game carries weight. None of that is in question. What is in question is what she has been doing with that platform. Over the course of Caitlin Clark's rookie season, Swoopes emerged as one of the most persistent and pointed critics of the young player, not in ways that engaged seriously with basketball questions, but in ways that seemed designed to undermine and diminish. She misrepresented the length of Clark's college career, publicly claiming she had played 5 years when the accurate figure is 4. She repeatedly shifted the goalposts on what would constitute genuine excellence, finding new reasons to qualify or minimize Clark's achievements as they accumulated. She became, in the words of multiple observers, the loudest voice of the old guard's resentment. And through all of it, the WNBA continued to employ her as an analyst and commentator. The league that was supposedly committed to supporting Clark and managing the toxic environment around her was simultaneously paying the salary of someone who was publicly working to erode her credibility. For Clark, watching that dynamic play out had to be clarifying in a particularly painful way. It confirmed what the Olympic exclusion and the on-court targeting had already suggested. The people running this league were not in her corner. In any other professional environment, the behavior Swoopes engaged in, publicly misrepresenting a colleague's credentials, repeatedly working to undermine their standing, would trigger some kind of HR response. Somebody would have a conversation, lines would be drawn, the organization would make clear that it expected its public-facing employees to maintain a basic standard of accuracy and professionalism. In the WNBA, it generated a media contract.
The WNBA All-Star Game provided the clearest possible refutation of every chemistry argument that had been used to justify Clark's Olympic exclusion. Clark's team, playing against the very Olympic squad that had decided she did not fit, dismantled them. She was hitting shots, finding open teammates, running the offense with the kind of precision and creativity that should have made the selection committee's reasoning look embarrassing. It did not look like a player who needed more time to integrate into a system. It looked like a player who should have been starting for the national team months earlier. After that game, the story shifted. The chemistry explanation, as already thin to begin with, became essentially impossible to defend. What the All-Star performance revealed was not a basketball problem, it was an ego problem. The veterans did not leave Clark off the Olympic roster because she wouldn't fit the system. They left her off because the system, as they defined it, did not have room for someone who might outshine them.
There is a rivalry at the center of the story that deserves its own careful examination, because the way it has been handled, or more accurately, mishandled by the league, tells you almost everything you need to know about the institutional failures at play here. The Clark-Reese dynamic did not begin in the WNBA. It began on the biggest stage in college basketball, in a national championship game that captured the country's attention and produced moments that became genuinely iconic. The celebration that followed Reese's team's victory, the response from Clark's supporters, the way the moment was interpreted and reinterpreted across social media platforms that reward outrage over nuance. By the time both players entered the professional league, they were already carrying a rivalry that had been shaped by millions of people who had never watched a full game of women's basketball before. A smart, thoughtful league would have recognized what it had and managed it accordingly. It would have understood that rivalries are assets when they're channeled productively, when the competition stays on the court and the story being told is about two extraordinary athletes pushing each other to be better. It would have worked actively to keep the narrative at that level, to separate the legitimate athletic competition from the toxic commentary that had attached itself to it. The WNBA did not do that. What it did instead was let the toxicity fester, because the toxicity drove engagement. The clicks were there. The controversy was generating attention. The rivalry, handled badly, was still producing the kind of social media heat that makes leagues look culturally relevant, even when the underlying dynamics are anything but healthy. And so the league stood back and let it run. The moment that crystallized this failure, the moment that moved the needle from poorly managed to actively irresponsible, came when Angel Reese responded to a hard foul on Clark with visible celebration. The optics were damaging. The conversation that followed was ugly, racially charged in ways that hurt both players, and handled by league officials with the kind of institutional cowardice that had been defining their approach to the Clark situation from the beginning. They said nothing clear. They drew no lines. They let the story spin until it had done its damage, and then they moved on. Clark took the high road every time, every single time. She declined to play the victim publicly. She refused to engage in the back and forth that would have generated headlines and followers and given the people stirring the pot exactly what they wanted. She showed up, competed, and kept her personal feelings about the situation out of the public domain with a discipline that most people in her position, 22 years old, under extraordinary pressure, absorbing hits both literal and figurative, could not have maintained. But the high road has a cost. It costs something every time you absorb a situation that does not deserve to be absorbed quietly. It costs something to watch a league profit from a toxic dynamic that is actively making your professional life harder. It costs something to see your name and your image used to generate engagement, while the people generating that engagement show zero interest in protecting you from the worst consequences. Everyone has a breaking point. The evidence suggests that Clark may have found hers.
The fan base split that is developed around this situation is one of the most significant threats to the WNBA's long-term health, and the commissioner's interview made it dramatically worse. On one side, you have the league's original supporters, fans who have been there through the lean years, who have real history with this sport, and who have complicated feelings about a newcomer receiving the kind of attention the league's established stars never got. Their frustration is understandable, even when the way it gets expressed is not. On the other side, you have the millions of new fans who came to women's basketball specifically because of Clark, who have no strong prior allegiance to the league's existing culture, and who are watching what is happening to her with a protective fury that the league has done nothing to diffuse. Those two groups are not inherently incompatible. A smart league, a well-led league, would be working overtime to build bridges between them, to tell a story that honors the history of the sport while celebrating what Clark has added to it, to create a big tent where both sets of fans feel like they belong. Instead, Engelbert went on television and effectively told the new fans that their concern for Clark's safety was a marketing metric. Those fans will not forget that. And if Clark exits the national program, a significant number of them will follow her out the door. The Los Angeles Olympics are 3 years away. On paper, they represent the single greatest opportunity women's professional basketball has ever had. A home games scenario, on the biggest sporting stage in the world, in a city that is a global media capital, at a moment when women's sports are experiencing a cultural momentum unlike anything in recent history. The WNBA should be positioning itself right now to make that moment transformational. Without Caitlin Clark, it will not be.
That is not a criticism of the other extraordinary athletes in the league. The talent is real. The competition is fierce, and the U.S. national team will be strong regardless of who is on the roster. But the Olympics in the modern era are not just athletic events. They are cultural moments. They are the intersection of sport and identity and storytelling at a global scale. And the person who makes women's basketball part of that conversation in a way that reaches beyond the sport's existing audience, the person who attracts the casual fan, the international viewer, the people who will be watching not because they follow the league, but because they cannot look away from this particular athlete, is Clark. She is the crossover. She is the one who makes women's basketball appointment viewing for people who do not watch women's basketball. The U.S. team will win medals without her. It will not create the cultural moment that LA 2028 could be. The collective bargaining situation adds another layer of urgency to all of this. The WNBA players are pushing for a new agreement, better salaries, better benefits, better conditions across the board. Those demands are legitimate, grounded in years of players being undervalued relative to the revenue they generate and the talent they possess. The league should be meeting them seriously. But the players' ability to negotiate from a position of strength depends directly on the league's continued revenue growth, and that growth is not a given if Clark disengages. The players who have been most resistant to Clark's presence need to reckon with something uncomfortable. Their leverage in those CBA negotiations exists in significant part because of her. The charter flights they now enjoy exist because of her. The television money that has made bigger salaries possible exists because of her. Removing her from the equation or pushing her to a place where she reduces her commitment to the league and the national program does not just hurt the WNBA's image, it directly impacts every player's financial future. There is a human element to this story that sometimes gets lost in the business analysis, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. Caitlin Clark did not come into the WNBA calculating leverage and building an exit strategy. She came in as a young woman who had dreamed about this league her entire life. She grew up watching Diana Taurasi and Sue Bird and the players who built women's professional basketball into what it is today.
She came in with respect for the history of the sport, with a genuine desire to contribute to it, and with the kind of quiet professionalism that should have been easy to embrace. What she found instead was an environment that treated her dream like a problem, that saw her success as a threat rather than a gift, that allowed her to be physically targeted while leadership watched, that used her name to sell tickets and her image to sign television deals while doing nothing meaningful to protect her from the ugliness that followed, and that when finally given a direct opportunity to speak up for her, chose to talk about Magic Johnson and Larry Bird instead.
The damage to Clark personally, to a young woman who simply wanted to play basketball at the highest level and represent her country, is something that the numbers in the revenue analysis cannot capture. But it is real, and it matters, and the people responsible for it should be sitting with a level of accountability that so far nobody in league leadership appears to be experiencing. The commissioner is running out of time to respond to this in a meaningful way, not with a corporate statement carefully engineered to minimize liability, not with another interview where she talks about the business opportunities embedded in conflict, with something genuine, an actual acknowledgement that what happened to Clark, the exclusion, the targeting, the institutional indifference, was wrong. A clear demonstration that the league understands what it almost lost and is committed to doing things differently. The kind of leadership moment that situations like this require and that, so far, has been conspicuously absent. If that does not happen, and the track record here does not inspire confidence, then the scenario that seemed unthinkable a year ago starts looking increasingly inevitable. Clark builds her brand independently. She creates the media company, the camps, the content infrastructure, the alternative platform that someone with her profile and her following can absolutely construct without the WNBA's involvement. She remains a dominant force in women's basketball, but does so on her own terms, outside the institutional framework that failed her. And the league watches its golden era slip away because the people running it could not see past their own egos and their own defensiveness long enough to protect the thing that was making all of it possible. The WNBA needed Caitlin Clark to save it, and for a while it looked like she might. She brought the ratings, she brought the money, she brought the fans, she brought the cultural moment that everyone in women's sports had been waiting for. And in response, the league gave her an Olympic snub, a season of uncalled fouls, a commissioner who compared her harassment to a marketing campaign, and a culture of veteran gatekeeping that made her feel like an outsider in the sport she had dedicated her life to. The next few months will determine whether any of this is salvageable, whether the right conversations happen behind closed doors, whether the people with the power to change the dynamic choose to use that power before it is too late, whether Caitlin Clark, who has shown nothing but class and professionalism through all of it, decides that the institution deserves another chance, or whether she concludes that the revolution she was supposed to lead is one she is better off launching somewhere else. The WNBA stands at a crossroads that it did not have to reach. The path that led here was paved with decisions that did not have to be made the way they were made. And the cost of getting it wrong from this point forward is not just a lost season or a bad headline cycle. It is the loss of the most important thing that has happened to women's professional basketball in a generation. She came to play. They made her feel unwelcome. Now the question is whether the institution that failed her has the self-awareness to admit it and the will to make it right before the most valuable player in the history of the league decides she has seen enough. The clock is ticking, and right now it is not ticking in the WNBA's favor. What do you think? Has Clark earned the right to walk away from a system that treated her this way, or does she owe it to the future of women's basketball to stay and fight from the inside? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this kind of deep dive content is what you're here for, make sure you're subscribed because this story is far from over.